Hi there. Welcome to Pearls of the Parsha. Our Parsha for this week is Ki Tavo. Some say Ki Sove, but whether tomato, it is one of those paramount Torah portions, as we'll see in a second. It is required reading, in fact, before the high holidays, before the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. Let's get started with the general overview. The Israelites are commanded to bring the first of their fruit to the temple and to deliver all tithes to their proper recipients. Moses explains how the blessings and curses are to be proclaimed on Mounts Gerizim and Tavo when the Jewish nation enters into Israel. A few parshas ago, we actually began learning about this concept that eventually, when we enter the land of Israel, we will proclaim blessings on Mount Gerizim and curses on Mount Tavo. The details were not given at that point, they are given in our parsha. He then details the blessings they will receive for following the commandments of the Torah and the calamities which will result from disregarding them. The name of the Torah portion, which always is a point of discussion because the name of anything in the Holy Tongue, in Torah parlance, is not just some humanly assigned name, but rather a divine window into the essence of the entity that is being named. Whether it's an inanimate object, whether it's a living being, certainly if it's a human being, we always focus on the Hebrew name of a person, for example, when they go up to the Torah or when they need refuah shlema, a recovery to feel better. And so when we look at the Torah portions, their name also gives an insight into the respective Torah portions' essence. Ki tavo or ki save means when you will come. It comes after last week's Torah portion, which was called ki teitse or ki seitse, when you will go out. And so the deeper implication of the pairing of these two Torah portions, ki teitse followed by ki tavo, is that when you will go out, that will result in when you will come in. When the soul will go out into the physical world, will descend into the physical world, a world that is not easy for the soul to descend into, a world that conceals divinity, where it's not always easy to do what's right, to follow God's will. Nevertheless, it's specifically and only when ki say, when you will go out, when the soul will descend into this difficult environment in order to elevate it, that we will then have ki tavo, when you will go in, namely into the entry into what is parenthetically known as the land of Israel. The verse here refers specifically when you will go into the land of Israel, the land that God is giving you, but in the deeper sense, a land or a holy environment where divinity is revealed. And so only again, when we have that exit into a little bit of a difficult environment, when the soul descends into the world, when the Jewish people exited Israel into exile, only because of that and through the labor of that environment, we will have then ki tavo, you will enter into the land of Israel. As we said earlier, there are a few Torah portions, a few sections of the Torah, more accurately, that the Talmud requires to be read in preparation for certain days, for certain holidays in the year. For example, the Torah portion of Bechukotai, Bechukotai, specifically the blessings and curses there at the end of the book of Leviticus, is required reading before the holiday of Shavuot. Because on Shavuot, we received the Torah for the first time 3,300 whatever years ago. Every year subsequently, we re-experience the giving of the Torah. And so we have to know what we're in for, as it were, when we are to receive the Torah. What is at stake? If you do what the Torah says, this is what's going to happen. If you don't do what the Torah says, that's what's going to happen. So therefore, there's that requirement that we should be informed consumers, as it were. There should be that requirement that we read what's at stake before we get the Torah. The same kind of logic applies to our Torah portion and the holiday of Rosh Hashanah and into Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is when we are judged, signed, and sealed for positive or for the opposite based on our behavior. And again, with that being the whole crux of those 2 days of the holy days, of the high holy days, we should again know what's at stake. And so the rewards for doing what's positive and the opposite for doing what is the opposite. Therefore, it's required reading before Rosh Hashanah. But being that the name of the Torah portion, though it's gleaned from the beginning of the Torah portion, applies to the entirety of the Torah portion, including that section of our Torah portion, which is the required reading before Rosh Hashanah, the rewards and punishments, the curses, all of the negative things that are written here. There has to be some kind of a relationship between the name Ki Tavo, when you will go in, when you will enter, and those negative results of negative behavior. And so our sages tell us that this, in fact, the commentaries tell us that this, in fact, is kind of the silver lining. That even if there are to be some kind of maledictions that come because of our misbehavior, the negative things that are written towards the end of our Torah portion, nevertheless, it's all under the flag, under the guise of Ki Tavo, when you will come into the land that God is giving you. In other words, regardless of what may happen in the interim, whatever kinds of dissents may exist, nevertheless, they will always, in the end, result in the ultimate ascent of our entry into the land of Israel, into that holy environment. How is that going to happen? Again, when we will go out, like last week's Torah portion, Kitetse, will that going out into the world possibly result in even missteps on our behalf, and therefore possible rectifications that aren't necessarily going to be so easy as detailed in the curses of our Torah portion? That's possible. But even if that happens, Ki Tavo, you will come in to the land that God is giving. The first aliyah. This section introduces us to the mitzvah of bikurim, the requirement to bring one's first fruits to the holy temple. On a deeper level, when we look at any kind of a plant, a tree, for example, that produces these kinds of first fruit, we see that there are roots, we see that there are branches, and then there's the actual fruit. The roots, on a deeper level, represent our forefathers. They are the reason why we are Jewish. They're the root, just like the reason why the tree is alive is because of the root system. Then there is the trunk and the branches. Those are the leaders of the Jewish people. And then there's the fruit. The fruit are actually not just the Jewish people in general, but specifically the young people amongst us. Especially when here we're talking about the first fruit, when a first fruit first blossoms or first ripens, that is a reference specifically to the youth of the Jewish people. And so here, the idea is not only that there should be this initial connection to the branches or the trunk, the leaders of the Jewish people, or eventually to the roots, the forefathers, and then after the fruit is taken off of the tree, then, whatever, do with it whatever you want. For example, that kind of an approach as it relates to the youth of the Jewish people, especially in the context of their education, would be maybe, of course, you have to have a bris if it's a boy, and you have to, have maybe a bar mitzvah, a bas mitzvah for a girl, basic Jewish things here and there, but fundamentally, fine, that's enough, and then go live a regular secular life. That is absolutely not the approach that the Torah requires. Of course, the tree is the source of the fruit, and the fruit does come off of the tree. But once the fruit comes off of the tree, that first fruit, representing the youth of the Jewish people, what happens to it? We bring it to the Kohen, to the holy temple, because the idea is not just initially beginning a child's life with his education in Judaism, but rather he should have a continuing connection, a continuing education within Judaism for the rest of his life. We'll note that the first and the best of everything is to be brought to God. For this reason, we have the first fruit being brought for God's sake into the temple. In this case, however, it's not just brought to the temple and maybe burned up on the altar or something. It's specifically given to the Kohen. The Kohen is one who, on the one hand, not of his own volition, not of his own accord, has achieved that level of being a Kohen. It's just because his father was a Kohen and his father was a Kohen and until you get to Aaron, Moses' brother. So in that regard, it was visited upon him, this status of being a Kohen. At the same time, the Kohen has certain things that he is required to do above and beyond the regular Jewish person, certain things that he's prohibited from doing above and beyond the regular Jewish person, behavior that now is the standard higher than the regular Jewish person that the Kohen has to abide by. So even though it began with something above him, he didn't choose to be born to a father who was a Kohen. At the same time, once he has become a Kohen by this top-down dynamic. He behaves as a Kohen because that's what he has to do from below now to above. The same exact dynamic or paradigm is our obligation when it comes to serving God. We were taken and chosen and imbued with a certain holiness, given the commandments, sanctified by the commandments, because God decided, not because we earned anything. But once that's the case, we have an obligation to live up to our part of that relationship. And so initially it's top down, but then we have to reciprocate with the bottom up, our part of our behavior. This mitzvah applies to fruits and produce grown in the land of Israel, and only those for which the land of Israel is praised, namely wheat, barley, dates, figs, grapes, pomegranates, and olives. So whether it is another kind of a fruit grown in the land of Israel or these specific species grown outside of the land of Israel, this mitzvah would not apply. So a farmer back in the times of the temple growing apples in the land of Israel is not obligated with this mitzvah of bringing the first fruit. Or a farmer outside of the land of Israel, let's say in Babylon or somewhere, or in Syria or somewhere, that is growing grapes, one of the species that the land of Israel is praised for, still does not have to bring the first fruit because it's not within the land of Israel, or it is within the land of Israel, but it's not one of those 7 species. Furthermore, the entire question as to when this mitzvah begins is a point of discussion amongst our sages. One opinion says it begins immediately. As soon as a particular Jewish person comes into the land of Israel, gets his land, plants, and has first fruit, he is obligated to bring the first fruit. Another opinion, and this is in fact the halacha, says that this entire mitzvah only begins when everyone has gotten their respective pieces, parcels of the land of Israel. So not immediately, but rather after 14 years of conquering the land of Israel for 7 years, and then apportioning and settling the land of Israel for another 7 years, altogether 14 years. The reality that there are these 2 opinions means that there's some level of validity to both approaches, both as it relates to the actual mitzvah of the first fruit, and also how it applies to the first fruit mitzvah for us nowadays, being that there is no temple, being that we can't really do this mitzvah in the full normative way as back when the temple was or when the temple will be. When it comes to our fulfillment of this mitzvah, the deeper implication of this mitzvah for our day and age, the opinion that says that it applies immediately means that as soon as we wake up, as soon as we begin our day, that's the beginning of, as it were, our fruits. And so the first thing we have to do is turn to God. And that's in fact what we do. As soon as one wakes, one should think of God and one should utter the thanksgiving sentence, thanking God for returning our soul within our bodies after we slept. In that perspective, from that perspective, that the mitzvah of Bikurim starts as soon as somebody would have first fruit in the land of Israel, regardless of whether the nation has conquered and settled the land. That's that approach. Right after Meida'ani, we of course get ready for the day, and then we do the morning prayer. Same concept. We don't really do anything before we say Meida'ani and when we pray, and only then do we begin our real day, because that's the immediately first thing that we do. It has to be for God's sake. The opinion that says that no, first we have to conquer and settle the whole of the land of Israel doesn't change or doesn't negate the fact that, yes, when you wake, of course you have to say Meida'ani, and then the first real endeavor of the day is to pray the morning prayer. That's for sure. But when is it real fruit? It's not real fruit unless and until you have entered the world, and then you have positive kind of results from involvement in the mundane world, which elevates that mundanity and produces fruit that now must be brought to the temple, to the Kohen in the temple. That's the implication of once the land of Israel is conquered and settled, only then does the mitzvah apply. And that, of course, is the final adjudication. Not immediately, but rather only once the whole of the land of Israel was conquered and settled, only then can we really consider fruit as fruit? And then the first of those fruits goes to the Kohen in the temple. The same thing for us. Of course, it's a mitzvah to pray. It's not a question. But real spiritual fruit, real holiness is only once we begin to transform the mundane realm, once we conquer and settle the land of Israel. That really is the implication of our involvement in the mundane world. When in the temple, the owner of the fruits recites a brief thanksgiving prayer to God and presents the produce to the priests. So among the things that he says actually is cited in the Haggadah, where we say, thank you to God for saving us from Laban. If you remember, this is Rebekah's brother, the father of Rachel and Leah, who eventually would be the wives of Jacob, and from Pharaoh. Now, the reality is that we were saved from lots of other things. Why specifically are we mentioning Laban and Pharaoh and not, for example, Amalek or whoever? Even though definitely we've had many, many situations where God has saved us, it was only really with Laban and with Pharaoh that we found ourselves almost basically like settled there. Jacob lived with Laban for 20 years. We were in Egypt for over 200 years. So it's, kind of a more permanent setting, as opposed to our war, but a very temporary, short-lived one with Amalek or with other nations that warred against us. And so the real thanksgiving for God saving us is not necessarily just from the dangers of Laban and Pharaoh, because again, we had other dangers, but rather from that mindset of being settled in an environment that's incorrect or inappropriate for a Jew or for the Jewish people. To be settled with a Laban, who was a Ramai, a trickster, or to be settled in Egypt with a Pharaoh, where the land of Egypt was known as the focus of immorality of the world at the time. That is an inappropriate environment for a Jew or for the Jewish people. And so forget about the actual danger of the person or the nation. The fact that we can even accept being in such a place in a settled fashion, that needs saving from. And therefore, that's where we emphasize our Thanksgiving prayer to God in the temple. The second aliyah. During temple times, Jewish farmers were required to separate from their produce several different tithes. These were distributed to the priests, the Levites, the poor, and one tithe which was eaten by its owners in Jerusalem. The different tithes were not all given each year. Rather, there was a 3-year cycle. So in essence, 3 years followed by another 3 years. That's 6 years in total. And then we come to the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year, where nobody's farming anyway. And so obviously there's no tithe to be given. In this aliyah, the Torah gives the procedure to be followed on the day before Passover during those years which followed the conclusion of a cycle, because that's when you have to be done with all of that tithing from that 3-year cycle. The farmer was to declare that he has performed all his tithing duties and then beseeches God to bless his people and the land. One of the particulars that the farmer says in that he separated all of these tithes is that he says, I didn't have anything to do, or the tithing had nothing to do with anything related to death. I didn't eat from it when I was in mourning. I didn't use any of the benefits for anything related to burial. Literally, the words in the verse is that I didn't give it to a dead person. So death is the antithesis of what we're talking about in this case. The Parshah, of course, this section of the Parshah, is read every year in close connection with the 18th day of the Hebrew month of Elul. In fact, this year, it is read on that date. Shabbat will be Chai Elul, the 18th day of the month of Elul. Chai, 18, means life. So it's, in essence, the life force, the engine of the life force of Elul. It's pointed out that from Chai Elul until the end of the year is exactly 12 days. The 18th, 19th, all the way to the 29th, and there are always 29 days in the month of Elul. There are 12 days. Each one of those 12 days corresponds to the 12 months of the year that we're about to finish. So on the 18th of Elul, that would correspond to the first month of this year that we're about to finish. The 19th of Elul, the second month of this year that we're about to finish, and so on and so forth, until we get to the 29th day, which is the last day of the year, corresponding to the last month of the year as well. It's a last opportunity to do a proper accounting and a proper return, tshuva, from all of the things that we didn't do as well as we should have, or that we need to strengthen and improve and continue into next year. And so it is that source of a final injection, as it were, of life into this process during Elul, where we're preparing for the high holidays. For that reason, it's the antithesis of anything to do with death. Rather, it is specifically focusing on life. When he beseeches God to bless his people and the land, he says, Hashkifa me'ein kodshecha. Deeply look, not just look, but hashkifa, deeply look. In modern Hebrew, glasses, which help a person to see better than his eyes can see on their own, are called mishkafayim. Ashkafa is one's deeper perspective on life. So when we ask, or when this farmer asks God, Hashkifa me'ein kodshecha, deeply look from your holy dwelling place. In essence, the idea is look beneath, look deeper than just the rubric of these were my requirements, did I fulfill them? These were my prohibitions, did I violate any of them? Look deeper at the reason why I'm asking for blessings, especially material ones, because seemingly as I stand before God, as I'm fulfilling the commandment specifically to be done in the temple, the holiest place in the world, why in the world should I be focused on the material? Why should I be asking for blessing on the land, for example? In other words, farming and all good stuff in material sense. If my intent is for materiality in and of itself, that's a massive sin. I should be focused on God, and I'm focused on my own, stomach or pleasure or whatever. But I'm not looking, I don't want that God should look at that superficial perspective. I want that God should have a deeper looking, namely, see that when I ask for material things, I should be, and I am asking for them to have the material resources in order to be able to serve you. I can't give tzedakah if I don't have money. I can't make a nice Shabbos meal or a nice Yom Tov meal if I don't have food, and so on and so forth. So look deeply, realize that my requests for material blessing are really for you, for God's sake in and of itself, because of this essential connection that I have with you. The third aliyah, Moses admonishes the Jews to observe God's commandments, reminding them that they have selected him to be their God, which should be an uppercase G, and he in turn has chosen them to be his holy and treasured nation. In his opening statement, he says that you should guard to do, meaning both negative violations don't violate, or prohibitions, I should say, don't violate, and do, in other words, requirements you should fulfill, these statutes and the judgments. So throughout Deuteronomy, we actually have a very similar kind of a quirk in that Moses mentions statutes and judgments, even though there are three kinds of commandments in that regard. You can take the overall 613 commandments and divide them into many different categories. You can analyze them and divide them into do's and don'ts. You can analyze them and divide them into personal, meaning just between me and God, even if nobody else in the world exists, I still am obligated to do this commandment. And those can be positives or negatives. For example, I am obligated to put on tefillin as a positive do, even though I may be the only Jew in the world. And I'm prohibited from eating pork. That's obviously a violation, a prohibition. Even again, I may be the only Jew in the world. Then there are also the communal commandments between me and my fellow. It doesn't apply that I must give charity unless there's somebody else to give charity to. It doesn't apply that I can't speak Lashon Hara, I can't speak gossip to someone about someone unless there are other people around. So that's another way of dividing the commandments into two categories, personal versus communal. Another methodology is to divide them into three categories, namely the judgments, the testimonials, and the statutes. Just as it sounds in English, judgments are those commandments that are so logical, so obvious, that they are basically the product, or could be the product, of better human judgment. Human intellect and judgment would understand why it's important to not murder or not steal. I want to live and keep my stuff. You want to live and keep your stuff. Let's not murder. Let's not steal. So obvious and so logical were these commandments, or are these commandments, that even before God ever commanded them on Sinai, they were part and parcel of the normal behavior and normal societal standard of behavior from the very beginning of creation. In fact, when we have the flood, and the verses there say that mankind had become sinful and violent, in other words, adjudicating them in a negative way, we don't have any verses prior to that which laid out any laws for society to follow that we can then say, oh, well, those are the laws that they violate. And nevertheless, the verse in Genesis, in Parshas Neach, says that, in fact, things had gone off the deep end and things were not right. What were they violating if there was nothing else earlier on the books as far as the laws? They were violating these very logical commandments, these very logical ideas that even basic human judgment would bring to be on the books, as it were. Followed by the judgments are the testimonials. Testimonials testify to something, and these commandments are classically ones that we would not understand, but God gives us an explanation for them, and once he does, then we understand them. The ideal example is Shabbat. There is no logical reason to divide time into a 7-day unit. You can very much make a logical case for a 24-hour day because there's a cycle of nighttime and daytime and 24 hours. It's logical to also make a unit called a month because we have a moon cycle that corresponds to the month. Obviously, the year. We have seasons and all the different things that we know about the cycle of a year. But the idea of a 7-day week is not logical at all. It doesn't fit nicely into a month. It's all over the place. So when God says, work for 6 days and rest on the 7th, that we don't understand. But when he continues and says, because I worked for 6 days in creating the world and rested on the 7th, oh, now that makes sense. We are testifying through the testimonial that is Shabbat. We are testifying to the fact that the world was created by God and specifically in 6 days, and then he rested on the 7th. So these are illogical at their beginning, but then explained and eventually logically understood by mankind. And finally, we have testimonials. We have statutes. Statutes are those that, just like in secular law, something may be the statutory limit. Why specifically the statutory statute of limitations, that is, on a particular crime, you can only sue in such and such case for 5 years. Why 5 years? Why not 6? Somebody decided. No specific logic. Commandments that are just because God said so. We don't understand them. God didn't explain them. Those are called statutes. There are 3 categories. Again, statutes, testimonials, and judgments. Moses, not only in our verse here in the 3rd Aliyah, but throughout almost all of Deuteronomy, when he mentions these, he mentions statutes and judgments, and he does not mention testimonials. Furthermore, he always mentions statutes first and then judgments. Why? Statutes and judgments are the opposite extremes of the overall 3 categories. Remember that statutes are completely illogical. They're supra-rational. Because God said so, we don't understand, we can't understand, and that's it. Judgments are so basic that God didn't even have to explain or give us a reason. We understand already automatically. It's logical to do or not do whatever the particular judgment is. These are polar opposites. And because testimonials begin supra-rationally, we don't know why God wants us to do it, but then he explains them, and we understand they're basically a synthesis of both statutes, in that to begin with, we didn't understand the testimonial, and judgments, in that eventually we do understand because God explains it. So statutes and judgments, when mentioned, basically automatically include within them, by implication, the testimonials. That answers why Moses doesn't mention all 3, but rather just statutes and judgments. How come he doesn't ever change the order? How come statutes is always first and then judgments? Because fundamentally, whatever the commandment is, whatever the Torah part is, we should look at it as first and foremost because God said so. Because even those things that God explained, or even those things that we understand on our own, are obviously understood by us to a limited level because we have limited intellects. But God's commandment is infinite, just like he is. So when we come to even a judgment, judgments are those that are so logical that God didn't even have to command them. But once he did command them, they become infinite. And our level of understanding of them can't be infinite because we have finite, limited intellects. So the only way to really tap into all of the commandments is to look at all of them first and foremost as statutes, because God said so. Hence, Moses always begins the phrase with statutes, and oh, by the way, also the judgments. The word that is used both in our selecting God to be our God and God selecting of us isn't really selecting, it's rather separating, in that we separated out all of the other options of faith and chose God. And God separated out away, separated us out of all of the other nations. This is the ultimate expression of holiness. When we look at a blessing, for example, that we make before doing a commandment, blessed are you, Lord our God, master of the universe, who has sanctified us or made us holy with his commandments and commanded us to whatever we're talking about. So the real definition of holiness is spirituality plus. Just spirituality on its own is actually very, very limited and limiting, in that it does not incorporate the physical or material realm. Holiness, on the other hand, is specifically applicable only when there's something else that is mundane. The classic example is when we look at betrothal under the chuppah, when the groom and bride stand there and the groom puts the ring on the bride's finger and he says, Hare'at mikudeshes li. Behold, you are sanctified, literally made holy to me with this ring, according to the law of Moses and Israel. The implication of made holy to me is there are lots of women in the world, but you and only you are my wife. There are lots of men in the world, but I and only I am your husband. To the extent that Adam and Eve never said this to each other, though they were married and had children, because there weren't any other men or women. So it was kind of a pointless statement in that context. Holiness, therefore, is specifically when we have spirituality within the physical realm, to elevate, separate out the stuff that's not elevatable and elevate up the things that are. So when God selects us, or we select him, that has to have practical expression specifically in the physical realm. It's for this reason that Rashi goes into this relatively long explanation as to how this word is very unique amongst all of the language of the Torah. You don't really have another place where we can kind of very clearly delineate what this word really means. And he says the closest basically that we can find is a verse that says something to the effect that sinners separate themselves out or glorify themselves. You know, if you don't have a good proof, don't bring any. Why in the world are we bringing a proof that's about sinning? And here we're talking about that God has chosen us, and this is kind of like a positive verse. Except that the ultimate expression of this kind of separation, of this holiness, of this elevation of that which is elevatable, is the process of return or repentance, tshuva, which of course has to begin with a person first and foremost doing a sin, doing something not quite right, and then feeling that pull to be closer to God and returning. If we were talking about spirituality alone, there's no sin to be had in the first place. There's certainly no tshuva needed. But because we're talking about holiness, which means involvement in the material, even if it's spiritually dangerous, but then if someone needs to come closer, to return, to repent unto God, oh, that's the ultimate expression of holiness. The fourth aliyah. The Jews are instructed to gather large stones when they cross the Jordan River. These stones were to be plastered, and the entire Torah was to be engraved upon them. Not only the entire Torah, but the entire Torah as it is translated into 70 languages, the 70 languages of the world. The expression that's used in the verse is explained well, and the implication that the sages tell us is 70 languages. Why in the world do we need the Torah to be written in all 70 languages of the world, especially since at that time all the Jewish people speak Hebrew? The answer is, at least on the simple level, that there are going to be people from other nations that are going to join the Jewish people. And so their mother tongue isn't going to be Hebrew. Furthermore, in time, there is going to be the concept of exile, where Jewish people don't have Hebrew as their mother tongue either. And they therefore should also not have a language barrier in connecting to the wisdom of God, that is the Torah. Another set of stones was also to be inscribed with the entire Torah and be set on Mount Tavo. There, in addition to those stones being set there, they were to make an altar. Now, in the procedures of how to make the altar, they are not allowed to hew the stones. Rather, the stones should be complete stones put together, not cut with any kind of a metal implement. So the Talmud tells us that when they were putting together these stones, if a stone had a crack or some kind of a blemish up to a very small amount, literally what's known as a fingernail amount, it was still okay. More than a fingernail amount, not okay. Once the altar was made, however, if any stone within the already made altar had any level of blemish, even smaller than a fingernail, no good, has to be replaced. But wait a minute. If it's okay to have a small amount, even a very small amount, but some amount of blemish in making the altar, what's the problem with if it gets a small blemish while it's already in the altar? What's the problem with keeping it there? Why does it have to be replaced? It seems inconsistent. Either no blemish at all across the board, whether in the building process or once it's created, or a small amount of blemish is allowed, whether in the building process or as it stands. The building process is the process of elevating that material resource which is elevatable. And so invariably, it's not going to be a perfect entity in that it has some amount of the negative, as it were, the other side was called in the Zohar, because it's mundane. Something that's holy is entirely good. Something that is mundane has a part of it, majority, minority, that already depends. A part of it that is holy and good, and a part of it that's the opposite. So in the process of selecting stones to build the altar, there could be a small little blemish. But once the altar is built and now has become sanctified, is itself holy, there can be no blemishes. And if there are, we need to replace them. Because when we have holiness, again, it has to be entirely permeating that particular entity. A holy entity is entirely good. So as we're selecting the resources, they're not going to be entirely good. A small blemish is allowed. But once the altar is made and the thing is now sanctified holy, it must be entirely holy or it's no good at all. And therefore, if there is a blemish, even a very, very small one on such a stone, once it's in the altar, then it has to be replaced. The fifth aliyah. The Jewish people are instructed to proclaim blessings and curses on Mount Gerizim and Mount Tavo. Even though they proclaim both blessings and curses, what's written in the actual verses here in our Parsha is only the curses. The blessings are implied from the curses. That is to say, for example, cursed is the one who makes an idol. So blessed is the one who doesn't make an idol. But if I'm supposed to say blessings and curses, how come only the curses are written? Either write both or write neither. But it's inconsistent to write only the curses, but then I have to somehow figure out the blessings from there. The reason why this is done is because even those things that appear negative, and this is going to apply especially towards the end of our Torah portion, even those things which appear negative are in fact positive. There are two statements in the Talmud regarding this kind of perceived negativity and that it's in fact essentially good. One is everything that Hashem does, or the merciful one, really. Everything that the merciful one does, he does for the good. And the more famous one is Gam Zu L'Teva, even this is for good. The implication of the first phrase, which by the way is in Aramaic, meaning not the holy tongue, a tongue that the Jewish people use, the colloquial tongue of the Jewish people at the time, but nevertheless not holy in the sense of the holy tongue of Lashon Kodesh. of the biblical tongue. Everything that Hashem does, that the merciful one does, he does for the good, is that the process itself is negative, but the goal is good. In the Hebrew is Gam Zulateva, in the Holy Tongue. Also, this is good. Not just that it's a negative means for a positive end, but because this is the Holy Tongue, it reveals that even the actual seemingly negative means is actually positive in and of itself. The reality is that only good comes from God. Perception aside, that's the truth. And so from the more worldly perspective of Aramaic, the colloquial tongue of the Jewish people in Babylon, in exile, yeah, even things that are negative eventually are done for the good. And so we have to wait for that to come around, for that good result, that good end to be, to be realized. But it doesn't negate the fact that the process is negative. Whereas when we look at the Hebrew, at the Holy Tongue version of the same idea, it says Gamzu, even this, even the negative actual process is in fact positive. For that reason, we only write the curses, because even those curses in and of themselves are positive. Hence, we can extrapolate from them the blessings that we are to proclaim. The elders of the Levite tribe, together with the Holy Ark, sorry about that, together with the Holy Ark, stood between the two mountains, and 6 tribes were stationed atop each mountain. The Levites and the priests faced each mountain alternately and stated the blessings and curses. First, they stated the blessings, and that's where the general rule comes from, with we open with a blessing. Even if we need to say something harsh or more kind of severe, we always open with a blessing. At the end of each of those statements of blessings and curses, we said, or the nation, the tribes, I should say, said Amen. The verse, in fact, says that each one and the whole nation said Amen. Amen, in and of itself, is a very difficult word to translate. Amen means I agree. Amen means God is trustworthy. In other words, everything is just and proper and right and righteous from God. But on a deeper level, Amen's deeper meaning is seen from its numerical value. The numerical value of Amen is 91. Aleph, Mem, Nun, 1, 40, and 50 altogether is 91. The holy name of God is actually written not with 4 letters, but with 8 letters. The 4 letters, as usually we know, Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. But then if you look in certain Kabbalistic writings, especially, the Hey is stretched out. And within that Hey, within that the cavity of that last Hey, is another 4 letters, Aleph, Dalet, Nun, and Yud, which is the way we actually say that word when we're making a blessing or reading from the Torah or whatever. Altogether, 8 letters, but 2 distinct words. The 4-letter name of God that we usually know as the Tetragrammaton is not only a name, but it's also an acronym for He was, He is, and He will be. Referencing the aspect of God that is transcendent of time and by extension transcendent of space. Infinite. He was, He will, He is, and He will be all at once. The last, in the little cavity of the Hey name that we're talking about, the name that we actually use, literally translates as my Lord. In fact, when Abraham is speaking to the 3 visitors that he has, he says, my Lord, don't go, stay at my inn, at my tent. So that, of course, is a reference to how God relates to the world. He's my Lord. The reality is that both names are in the same word, right? That second name is in the cavity of the last letter of the first 4-letter name. So they're really 2 aspects of the same God, and they're not separate. They're both functioning at the same time, completely integrated with each other. The numerical value of the whole thing is also 91. Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, and then Aleph and Dalet and Nun and Yud, all together is 91. So when we say Amen to a blessing, in this case to the blessings and the curses, we're not just saying I agree, though we are, of course. We're not just saying I agree. We're not just saying that God is righteous and just. We're also saying that the infinite aspect of God, which transcends the universe, etc., is the very same God, is the very same aspect of God that's in the world on its own very, very limited level. At the end of the Aliyah, we are told of the bountiful blessings which will shower us if we hearken to God's commands. Now, the idea that these blessings are the reward for serving God seems like we're being shortchanged in that we're accomplishing on a spiritual level, but we're receiving payment, as it were, or reward on a physical level. And even though spiritual and physical should be combined, spiritual is fundamentally greater than physical. So we're working in the US stock market, but we're getting paid, whatever rubles are, something much less valuable, pesos. That doesn't seem right. It's not that these blessings are our reward. There's a very clear statement from the Talmud that the reward for service of God, for the mitzvahs, does not exist in this world, rather it's in the world to come. The world to come being completely spiritual makes perfect sense. We accomplished on a spiritual level, we will be paid, as it were, rewarded on a spiritual level. If these blessings are not a reward, what are they? They are God investing and reinvesting in us. God gives us an amount of money. He sees that we use that money for his sake. He'll give us more. That's not the reward. That's because he wants a greater return on investment. He sees that he had a good initial return on investment. He will reinvest. We see, or he gives us money, or he gives us other resources, and he sees that we don't use them for his sake. He's not going to continue to give. That's not a punishment. That's just, I don't see that this stock isn't doing well. I'm not going to continue to reinvest. That is really the perspective of these blessings. When we look at them in that way, then all of a sudden, we understand why all of them are physical and material in nature, because the whole idea of serving God has to be a practical, physical expression of God's spiritual desires. In addition to the fact that we will get these blessings, the introductory verse there says that they will and will come upon you all of these blessings, and they will overtake you. V'hisigucha. The Hebrew word for "and they will overtake you," v'hisigucha, also can be rendered as "and you will be made to understand them." So, in essence, God is saying that not only are you going to get these particular blessings, but you will also get the understanding, the intellectual realization of how everything that you have is in fact a blessing from God, and therefore should be used, that resource should be used for God's sake. The sixth aliyah. This section continues with the aforementioned blessings and then launches a lengthy description of all the maledictions and suffering which will befall the Jews when they neglect the commandments. One of the blessings, before we get to the maledictions, is that you should be blessed as you go, and you should be blessed as you come, and you should be blessed as you leave. And so the sages explain that this is kind of the ultimate blessing, the ultimate wish, that a person should leave the world in the same way that he entered it, with no sin. When a person's born, obviously he has no sin yet. If he leaves the world in the same way, then he is blessed in both regards. Blessed in the sense that he entered the world with no sin, and blessed that he lived a life of no sin and left the world in the same way. The story is told of the second Chabad Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe. When he was a very young child, he heard the reading of this Parshah on the Shabbat, 2 Shabbats before Rosh Hashanah, and he fell ill. He fell ill so severely that it wasn't even quite clear if he would be able to fast for Yom Kippur. And what happened is that usually his father, the first Chabad Rebbe, would be the reader of the Torah in Shul. But at that point, his father was traveling, and so somebody else was reading. When they asked him, it's not like you didn't learn these verses before. It's not like you haven't heard the reading of this Torah portion before. Why all of a sudden this year are you all of a sudden so sick? He says, when father reads, one hears only blessings. In other words, when his father, who of course wasn't the typical person, but rather was a Rebbe, the Moses of his generation, the inner intent of even the harsh words of these curses or maledictions was heard. And in that regard, we would hear, or he heard, all the previous years that his father read from the Torah portion, from the Torah, that all of these maledictions are a way for us to make sure that we are doing what's right. And even though it's a dissent, and even though it's harsh, it is what was called nowadays tough love. And in that regard, it's love. When this other person, who was, a good person, I'm sure, but just a regular person, read them, all of a sudden, he heard something that he'd never heard before. Actual maledictions, actual suffering. So in this regard, it's explained that God only gives effluence, only gives good. Like, for example, a butler or a servant or a waiter that's pouring you a goblet of wine. The wine is great. You have a cup. Everything's fantastic. If, however, you move the cup or you put a cup that's broken or cracked under the stream of the wine, then all of a sudden there's wine spilled all over everywhere and it's a horrible situation. It's not because the guy who's pouring you the wine that you have a spill of the wine. It's because the vessel wasn't right. When God gives us effluence, spiritual life force, material resources, whatever, if we make the proper vessel, it's a blessing. If we don't make the proper blessing, then it turns into a concealed blessing. In essence, that you should fix your vessel, and then this is the blessing that you'll get. One of the things that's mentioned there is that all of these maledictions, etc., will come upon you because you did not serve God in joy. The simcha v'tuv leva, because you did not serve God in joy and in goodness of heart. In other words, even if you did everything that God asks, you fulfilled every last word of the code of Jewish law, but you didn't do so in joy and out of a goodness of heart and connecting to Him, that already means that a lot needs to be fixed. And so this kind of is a wake-up call. The seventh aliyah. Moses reminds the Jews that all the miracles which have been their lot from when God took them out of Egypt until that very day. He says something there that's a little bit strange. He says, and now, only today, God gave you a heart to know, eyes to see, ears to hear. But we see that that's not the case. We see that the Jewish people have thanked God and sang songs of praise and whatever for all sorts of goodness and miracles and salvation that God has given us. When we first left Egypt, there was a splitting of the sea. We sang a song of praise. So what does Moses mean? That only now we realize the kinds of miracles that God has done. There are two different kinds of miracles. One is an open miracle where God breaks the rules of nature and does whatever he needs to do for whatever purpose. That's like the splitting of the sea. There are other miracles which are enclosed in nature. In other words, they don't break the rules of nature. It seems like everything is just functioning in the normal way, except that God is pulling those strings and achieving whatever he wants to achieve in this particular situation. The classic example for that is Purim. The story of Purim seems, as you read it, just one coincidence after the other. This guy overheard that, and everything kind of just worked out, all by accident, as it were, and the Jewish people were saved. The reality, of course, is that God made it all work out, but he concealed that action on his part within nature, and so it just appeared as if things were just working themselves out in a coincidental fashion. It doesn't take much of a heart to know or eyes to see or ears to hear to recognize an open miracle. When God breaks the rules of nature and splits the sea, anybody could realize, oh, wow, that's God. And so that the Jewish people realized all along, thanked God for all along. But after these 40 years of travel in the desert, and right as they're about to enter the land of Israel, God now gives them the ability, a heart to know, eyes to see, ears to hear, to also recognize the hidden miracles within regular everyday life. They're going to go into a land where there's no more manna, open miracle. There's no more well of Miriam, open miracle. There's no more clouds of glory, open miracle. There's regular life, as it were. But it's not because of regular life that I'm going to have rain for my crops, or that my crops will grow, or whatever other things that in the physical realm of the land of Israel that the Jewish people are going to need. All of those things are still happening because God is making them happen. They're still a miracle, except that they are hidden in the normal functions of nature. To realize that that's the case, that takes an additional level of heart to know, eyes to see, ears to hear. It's worthwhile to note that the Talmud says that even though we will continue to do the commandments related to the other holidays, including Passover, where we had open miracles, the day itself, or the days of the holiday of Passover, for example, will not feel anything special when Mashiach will come. But the feeling of the day of Purim will still remain special, even in the context of all the special spirituality that will be felt throughout all of the time that Mashiach is here. In other words, the way that they put it is the holidays are all going to be nullified. In other words, the feeling of that special day being a holiday will not be here when Mashiach comes. But Purim will never be nullified, even when Mashiach comes. Why? The open miracle is actually a weaker presentation of God's strength. The fact that God, as it were, needs to break the rules of nature, he can do that. He's in charge of everything anyway. But that actually shows that he, as it were, cannot achieve that salvation, that goal that he wants to achieve within the rules of nature. Versus a miracle hidden or enclosed in nature is God working within the rules that he set up all along and still achieving the same thing that he wanted to. If I'm playing golf with the King of England, yeah, he can choose to hit a bad shot and ignore it and say that he didn't because he's the king. He's in charge. But if he beats me like that in the golf game, he's not a better golfer than I am. He just broke the rules. He changed the rules because he can, because he's the king. Whereas if he plays according to the rules, the same rules that I have to play by, and beats me, now he's a better golfer. It's for this reason that Purim, which is a hidden miracle, will not be nullified even in the context of Mashiach, whereas Passover, for example, that feeling of specialness of the holiday will be nullified because all the days are going to be open miracles when Mashiach comes in the first place. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening and Shabbat Shalom.